All right, I don't know. All right, okay, nice. So we're going to, I wanted to today do a lecture about the project of the office in a way that is a kind of constantly being defined project. But roughly, the things that we're most interested in now can roughly be described as a kind of engagement and an interest in the relationship between architecture, urbanism, and nature. And Guru Benazmo told me that coming to Norway to talk about nature was not good, so that I should talk about something else because everybody knows about nature. So I was going to talk about fish or oil, but those were also, I don't really know so much about. So we're going to talk about nature. I wanted to start because for us, we are very interested in sustainability, we're interested in green architecture, but for us it's much more about engaging with nature and really about, not so much about efficiency or building things responsibly, but really opening people's eyes to a different way of living together with nature and really defining nature in regards to architecture. So just to start very quickly with a brief history of nature and architecture, I think that most people are familiar with this image, the primitive hut. So the earliest days of thinking about the relationship between the outside world or the wilderness and architecture, it was almost as if nature kind of provided us the inspiration with which to build. And it was this kind of bountiful nature which provided shelter, and basically all of architecture sprung from nature. As cities evolved and civilizations evolved, nature took on many different aspects. A kind of ominous aspect, the feeling that if you simply left architecture alone long enough, it would eventually end up looking like this. That nature had this kind of dual side. And I think it's really in the debates, let's say, of the alignment between Voltaire and Rousseau, where this kind of dynamic starts to split into two directions, of course. The one direction that the city and civilization is the only way for man to live, and this is the advancement of the age, whereas Rousseau, on the other hand, arguing that man had gone wrong already by the 18th century and should return to a much more primitive state of equilibrium with nature. And I think that these kind of two paths diverged, let's say, for the next 200 years, and it really wasn't until the 20th century, the early part of the 20th century, that architects again started to address nature and architecture in, let's say, much more interesting, hegemonous ways. And I think I'm going to talk a little bit more about Corbusier, but I feel like the early modernists, at least, were dealing with nature in an interesting way and trying to reintroduce light, air, etc. into cities. I think this, with, let's say, the last half of the 20th century, this is an image by Daxiotis from his first Ekistics book, where basically with the kind of huge population growth that we've seen in the last century, and increasing human settlement, which of course now is only more egregious and urgent, Daxiotis kind of postulated that cities would eventually merge, forming these kind of linear mega-regions which would divide the world into a kind of built and unbuilt situation. We've been doing a lot of research into cities and nature and discovered, kind of to our fascination, this diagram by Paolo Soleri, the kind of crazy visionary person who lives in the desert of Arizona. This is a diagram from the 60s where he reproduces Daxiotis' diagram on the left and basically claims, he's kind of drawing a very thin line, let's say, but basically claiming that this is a terrible vision of the future because the kind of thickness of human settlement leaves only these small patches, which he calls the leftover of the natural. And I think, in the spirit of the time, proposes this kind of, instead, a very thin occupation, a kind of massive megastructural project, I guess designed by Paolo Soleri, to kind of thin out and to densify population so that nature can kind of exist much more as a kind of overwhelming force. And I think what's interesting for us is just that this debate was at such a scale and such a way of thinking by the 1960s and 70s that it was quite obvious that architects and urbanists would simply take on the idea of the world and the world in relationship to nature. And part of what we are interested in is the condition that we find ourselves in today, let's say after 30 years of not thinking about urbanism. Basically all of this kind of thinking stopped around 1970 or 1975. So part of it has been to kind of think why, and our book 49 Cities answers that, and to find new ways of thinking about nature. Because I think at this point it was still a fairly naive vision of the natural world, but the more that we think about it, and this, of course, this is maybe the non-Norwegian perspective, the more that we think about it, the more we realize that nature in its totality is a mitigated state, that we're really living in a position that Andraos calls second nature, where, let's say, even images such as this is Yosemite National Park, perhaps the most famous wilderness in America. You still pay an entrance fee, you have a parking lot, you have rangers. This view has been photographed 6 million times. So nature is no longer really nature. I mean, I'm not sure there is real wilderness anymore, and I think this is a map of the world showing all of the forested wilderness in existence now. I'm sorry, it's such a bad slide, but I mean, because this is Africa, this is South America. So you can see it's actually a very, very thin veneer of actual wilderness, which is defined as 5 square kilometers without a road or human settlement within it, which is actually quite a small area. And then just to remind you that you're not completely immune to this situation, this is a map of the wilderness in Norway over the past 100 years, which you can also see has gone through a fairly dramatic transformation during this same 100-year period. So I've organized the lecture around 3 or 4 different ways of looking at this question of nature, and then kind of showing how our work has responded to this thinking. So the first one is this idea that nature is as unnatural as architecture, which is what I was just saying, that in a way all nature is mitigated and mediated, and that this is a condition that exists. And for us, it's a kind of extremely liberating position to simply think about nature as an unnatural force and to kind of incorporate it into architecture. So just as a quick example, my partner, my wife and I, we used to work for OMA. We were doing big projects all over the world and decided to quit, form our own firm, and we basically moved into our apartment, waited for the phone to ring with our big urban project, and instead we got a commission for a doghouse. So since we were urbanists, we decided at least we'll do an urban doghouse. So because we saw that the life of the urban dog is maybe not that great. And so we decided to do something while this urban dog is, because this is his release into the world, but most of the time he's scooped up in an apartment. So what we designed was a doghouse with a treadmill and 3 video screens and an odor machine, so that while the dog was home in the apartment, it could have all the experiences of its rural cousins. So for example, they could chase butterflies for one day, and then the next day maybe chase cars, which is something most New York City dogs, it's not advised to do, let's say. Or they could spend a day at the beach, And so basically raise the urban dog's self-esteem and give it a kind of its own private world, so that while it was walking around the hard streets of New York, it had these kind of memories of its rural existence. So, for us, it was a kind of throwaway project because we quickly realized that dogs don't see color or motion or 2 dimensions. So it was a kind of failure project. But for us, we kind of put it away, but we keep coming back to it as it's become our kind of mascot project, because for us it represents 3 things that we try to do in all of our work. One of which is to address bigger questions. So if you're given a doghouse, let's address the question of the city and the countryside. The second is to approach things with a degree of humor, because we feel like humor is a kind of interesting way to dive at somewhat uncomfortable or serious questions, that if you can kind of come in through humor, oftentimes you can find a different approach to it. And then the third is this, this way of dealing with nature, in a kind of way that acknowledges and yet celebrates the state of nature today. So the way it works in a bigger project, let's say this is a master plan competition that we were invited to do in New York. This is, I always show this slide and I tell students that they should not put north sideways like this, but you can when you're a professional. So basically it's 9 blocks, this is the west side of Manhattan, and it's 9 blocks which were being rezoned for new residential and commercial development, and they have this kind of mid-block zone that they wanted to design a park and a boulevard, which is a very unique condition in New York, through the middle. And what was also interesting is that these mid-blocks are all underneath. If you lift the blocks, there's always something underneath. So this is a train that heads up to New York, so 2 of the blocks have a train track underneath it. Another 2 blocks have a subway running underneath it, and the last 2 have parking, were proposed to have big parking garages. So it was a park where basically if you dig deep enough, you're going to hit a train. And so essentially a park built over a bridge. And we realized that once you're building a bridge, economically speaking at least, it doesn't really matter if the bridge is sloped, raised, curved, filled, etc. Once you pay for the bridge, the structure doesn't matter. And so the first thing that we did was utilize this idea of a bridged park to create a topography. So these can be read as kind of different sections along the park. And then just to make it clear that we are not dealing with Olmsted anymore. You know, Olmsted designed Central Park, which is a completely fake landscape, and every hill that's in there is not a real hill. So in ours, where we have the hills, we also wanted to make sure it was clear that these were not real hills and kind of filled them with activity or program. So every hill has a program underneath it. And then we did this project with the Balmori Associates landscape architects and with the artist Fritz Haig, who works both with gardening and with animal habitats. And on this project we worked, so on the one hand we have a very fake nature, you know, with hills that are filled with cafes. And on the other hand we wanted to kind of reintroduce an aspect of wilderness into the city that didn't exist before. So we basically researched a number of animal habitats for animals that either used to live on the Isle of Manhattan or animals that are threatened that could survive in a city environment. So basically everything from wasps to turtles to salamanders to frogs. There's a big frog shortage in the world, and frogs actually have no qualms about living in the city. So basically we were able to get a lot of frog habitats. So to kind of play up this difference. And then secondly, this is something that runs throughout all our work, which is the idea that nature and the city can actually work together to create new ecosystems. That, in a sense, like a working farm, where the farmer's input makes the land more productive, the land's input into the city can actually make the city more productive. So a kind of relationship between the built and the unbuilt. So since these were all new buildings, for example, we proposed that there would be legislation that all new buildings have a green roof, and all buildings also collect all the rainwater for use in the park. So, and we did this for every system, but just looking at the water system, for example, we would then utilize that water infrastructure, the piping, etc., as not buried underground, but as visible elements that make up the parts of the park. So you have canopies and benches that would be made up of water pipes, and then we would use the these kind of big bladders to store the water in, which could also be like a big water bed for the kids. So that infrastructure, public space, and sustainability are kind of all working together in a very visible way to make this relationship between the buildings, the city, and the natural landscape clear. And then obviously all the water is used for irrigating the crops, etc. Yeah. The second aspect is what we call the jolt of nature, which is the idea that you can kind of put people in a situation where they're confronted with nature in a completely unexpected way, as a kind of jump start of a new way of thinking about the relationship between the city and nature. So for us, it's a kind of, it's a situation like in the ancient Roman house, for example, where at one point the roof disappears, the rain comes in, and you're outdoors again in the middle of the indoors. So kind of a different way of living together with nature. And we're also, this is another friend, Gianni Petagna, who was an architect in the 70s, who did an incredible series of projects in and around Minneapolis. he's still working today, but this is a project he did in Minneapolis by simply taking this abandoned school building and dripping water over it. You could do this here in Oslo, sure, to create a kind of temporary sculpture that disappeared after a few days. And then he did a second series of projects where he simply just claimed parts of landscape as architecture. So this is one of his architectural projects that he simply claimed. So if you were to do that here, this would be your architecture. And so another colleague and friend that we're working together with now is James Wines at Site, who I think was, I don't know how much you know of his work, but in the 1970s, Site did this incredible series of best department stores, which really were the first projects to really look at the relationship between nature and architecture in a funny, interesting, surreal, inspiring kind of way. So on the left is his project. It's a kind of terrarium. So inside that glass is not only a kind of indoor garden, but you also read the section of the soil, and there's animals burrowing and living in there. And then on the right, the project in Virginia, which is now a megachurch apparently, where he took an existing stand of trees and basically broke the facade in two. So you went through the normal glass doors into a forest again, and then into the department store. So in our own work, this idea of the jolt of nature takes many different forms. Sometimes it's simply by introducing green. But I think in the more exciting projects for us, it's even more unexpected. This is a headquarters building we built for Diane von Furstenberg, who's a fashion designer in New York, and it's a headquarters building for 250 people who work there, well, maybe almost 300 people now, who used to all work on one floor of a big industrial building. So the idea was to kind of, while we were now spreading them among 6 floors, this is a new building built behind some landmark facades, to create a kind of public gathering space and collective spaces for them, and at the same time accommodating all the offices. So the idea was to organize the building around this kind of shaft that cuts through it, which is a stairway, which also basically connects a series of double head spaces. So here's the entrance, here's like a showroom / performance space, and then that kind of diamond penthouse that emerges out of the top. So that diamond element that you see is the kind of culmination of this internal circulation, which also becomes the social space of the company. So people are meeting on the stair, and there's always a connection, let's say, between consumption, because of the ground floor is the main flagship store, and then there's showrooms and offices, all kind of connected through the device of this stair. And so the first kind of jolt of nature is when you walk in, you're immediately confronted 6 stories up with the sky again. So you kind of walk in, and all of a sudden the sky is framed at that diamond penthouse, and you have this kind of strange section that connects you immediately up to the sky with birds flying by, etc. And the second was that we called it from the beginning a shaft of light, because we knew that light was very important to Diane and to fashion design in general, to see the clothes and the light. But we didn't know how we were going to do it, and we basically hooked up with a company in Austria that designs heliostat mirrors. So this is a diagram of how those mirrors work, where they're basically focusing and bringing light down the stairs. So we have this mirror here, which is situated by GPS and computer programs, so that every minute that the sun is out, it is tracking the sun moving. It can move this way and this way, and it's basically always calculating the difference between the sun angle at any one moment and the stair angle. And it's basically catching the light in such a way that it reflects it back to these 9 fixed mirrors, always at the same angle. So no matter where the sun is, it's always hitting these at the same angle, and each of these 9 mirrors are then focused on one of these 9 other mirrors, which then are these kind of special mylar mirrors that disperse the light out. And then the stair guardrail is made from 6,000 Swarovski crystals, which are basically structurally bracing the guardrail, which pick up the light and then disperse it again out to the floor. So it's kind of a neat trick on the one hand, and it does allow us to turn off the lights much more often than you would in a normal environment. But more importantly for us, it kind of, the most exciting thing about it is that it's a very different feeling of light. So when you're in the building, even for the people working there, first they can see the clothes in natural light, so they're very bright, kind of very neutral color light as you have from daylight. But more interestingly, you know, if a cloud goes over the sun, for example, the whole building dims. And I think many people who work there have no concept of what's going on. And yet they have this kind of almost intuitive sense of connection with the outdoors. So for us, that's a kind of really interesting moment, jolt of nature, where it's not really even made explicit, but somehow the building has this very strong connection with the natural rhythms of the sun and the city together. And it has a green roof. So I'm going to skip this project. It's a library. And then, because this is the second time I gave this lecture today, it was too long. This is another project where we worked with this jolt of nature. It's a shopping mall in a place called Dos Lagos, California, and we went there to visit the site, you know, expecting a nice Lagos Lake area, and there were no Lagoses. There was 0 Lagos. In fact, there was 0 shopping mall and there was 0 town. They were building the shopping mall and they were building the town for the people who live in that they could shop in the shopping mall. And really far from Los Angeles, like 2.5 hours. So we had this shopping mall, and it used to be an orange grove, so we wanted to kind of find a way to, our clients were Anthropology, a kind of interesting store, and basically find a way to confront people with nature. So we did it in 2 different ways. First, we were required by the mall people to keep this beige color, because that is what connects Banana Republic to Chili's or whatever was over there, with this kind of consistent beige color. But we persuaded them that we could put this screen over it, and then we planted the top with 98,000 pounds of dirt and jasmine vines that are growing basically down and around the circle. So now it's down to here, and basically goes from beige, 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 more and more, and then all green over the entrance. So that was the first way. And then the second was we cut a hole in the roof and basically inserted a Roman atrium with no shopping. So that's also very shocking. Like, you can't buy anything in the middle of the store. And then we planted one lonely orange tree in there in defiance of its brothers who were killed. And so you basically have this kind of connection, and it rained, well, it never rains in Southern California, but if it did, it would rain in there. So there's that. Next, the idea that nature means more than flowers. For us, really, we are very interested in all of the different types of landscape, from gardens, obviously, but productive landscapes, and that there's a much more nuanced and broad and diverse idea of what nature is. And in fact, delving a little further, just as a side story, we came across this project in Argentina, where he actually proposed a kind of development of Villa Savoirs. So each one of these is a Villa Savoie in a kind of residential community. And furthermore, kind of basically, maybe you can read French, I cannot read it myself, but basically the idea is that because he's in Argentina, he said, you know, we could have all these Villa Savoirs, and then we could have like cows and sheep and the beasts wandering among the houses, you know, and so it's this kind of connection with agriculture and with wilderness and the world, which is very interesting. So really the slide that Adrian should show is like this one, which for us is very inspiring. And then another, this is Fritz Haig's other work. Fritz is an artist, and his most famous project is called Attack on the Front Lawn, where he basically persuades suburban home dwellers, first across America and then now across the world, to transform the front yard into a productive garden, growing vegetables and plants, and really pissing off the neighbors, like this guy, because they don't have to mow anymore. And so, and for us, in a way, what's inspiring about this is not necessarily the garden, which is nice enough, but the fact that Fritz has kind of created a manifesto, and that with such a small move, through his use of media and his kind of international fame, he's able to kind of transform it into a movement and a manifesto and a comment on the suburbs and the city. And for us, I think that's the way forward for architects. Obviously, since the baby boomers, it's always been this kind of this or that, black or white situation. And what I think is fascinating about our current situation and the current generation, our generation, and the generation younger than us coming up, is that I think we have this kind of sense of irony and the ability to hold two ideas at one time, both the big and the small. And so that's also something we do in our work. Just quickly to show a project, this is a project in Shenzhen where this idea that nature can be a productive force rather than simply something to look at is utilized. This was a project for mixed-use skyscraper in China. Obviously they have tons of skyscrapers, I'm not saying they don't, but they're all single use. The concept of mixed use is really just now taking hold in China. So you actually have many situations in the city, like on the left, where the hotel and the offices are in towers, the mall is in a small thing, the transport stations another. So this was a competition for a very mixed tower as a kind of experiment. So it's sponsored by the subway company. So this is a subway, and this is a huge bus station, a shopping mall, two different kinds of offices and a hotel, all mixed in one tower. And so we wanted the building itself to kind of demonstrate this transition, and that the building itself would actually kind of move from the horizontal to the vertical. And we basically put all these elements, and we added this idea that there would be parks also distributed vertically throughout the project. And that each park is not simply just a place of green to look at, but each one performs a certain task. So this is a kind of diagram of the building. And here, we don't have many ideas, but this is like the same idea as the orange tree. It used to be a lychee field, so we put a lychee field there. And then a huge problem in China now is migrating birds, not having anywhere to land and basically flying until they drop. And Shenzhen is on a big migration path, so the idea was that buildings could sponsor small bird sanctuaries and places for them to rest, so that's a bird sanctuary. And then these two kind of dramatic cuts, we wanted to really make this insertion of nature very dramatic, so the idea was to kind of just simply take big diagonal chunks out of the building and put these two, what we called aquatic slices in. And it was a very interesting situation because of the hotel and the office programs being in the same building, we were able to take advantage of a lot of interesting synergies. Obviously there's the day-night cycle where the offices were in use during the day, the hotel more at night, but also the water use with a kind of highly intensive use of water in the hotel and a very minimal use of water in the office building. And basically by collecting rainwater and also taking everything from gray water to black water from the hotel, we could utilize the cuts as two living machines, which is a natural water filtration system that can actually take sewage and make it drinkable, which for some people is a normal thing, I guess, but it's also very special. And so the idea would be that these would be these water systems, and what was very lucky for us is that in China, to do a high-rise, every 15 to 20 floors has to be what they call a refuge floor. And that's a floor where you can have no program. It has to be completely empty so that people from the adjoining floors can gather there and wait to be rescued. So you have always these empty floors. The area that's needed for the people to gather is actually quite small. And so the idea was to utilize these empty floors underneath each cut as the locus for this water infrastructure, so that they become essentially huge cisterns, and we have the first and second phases of the water filtration that would happen on these floors. And then, as a kind of second advantage of these floors, we could utilize them, working with the structural engineers, Lira, as the kind of main trusses that allow us to cut out, the entire corner of the building. So, because they didn't require windows on those floors either. So those become kind of massive moments of steel, integrated within what is essentially one big frame. So it's not a kind of repetitive frame, but basically one big frame with these three moments of extreme strength, which actually allowed us, when we did all the preliminary calculations, to create a building which is kind of significantly lighter weight in terms of steel for height. At the same moment, we had these enormous cuts taken out of it. So this is a diagram of the height of the building versus the weight of the steel, and ours is, as you can see, there. The second thing was to make the building very efficient. We looked at all different types of build-up for the curtain wall with our consultants, and essentially discovered that the most important thing we could do for energy efficiency was to utilize punched windows. And simply by using punched windows instead of a curtain wall, we cut the light out and the heat gain by almost 60%, which I know in Oslo is like, but we need light. But in Shenzhen, you don't need light because it's hot. And to make these deep, so we got a little bit of self-shading. So essentially by integrating the steel structure within the wall itself, got self-shading. And then utilize the punch windows to kind of mimic to kind of reflect the structure that was going on behind it. So if it was behind the beam, you had thinner windows, and if it's on an open floor, you had thicker windows. So you kind of read the structure simply through the rhythm of the punched windows. And then this is what it looks like with these big cuts. And at night, obviously, it would be a little bit more dramatic. There's the garden, and then this is one of those cuts. On a much smaller scale, the idea of this productive landscape, or landscape that's actually functioning, was our entry for PS1 MoMA in 2008. Every year, MoMA sponsors a competition where young architects are asked to make a pavilion, a temporary pavilion for these parties that they have every summer, where up to 7,000 people come to this museum, PS1, in Long Island, which is owned by MoMA. And it's a competition where the only requirements are you provide shade, seating, and water. Those are the only 3 requirements. So and you have to build it yourself. So we figured if we're gonna, and you end up losing a lot of money normally, but you get a lot of publicity. So it's money, publicity. And so basically we felt like if we're gonna be doing this, why don't we add some other program and kind of use this as a platform to test out some of these ideas that we have about cities in real life, since there's no requirement. So the idea was to create a kind of new urban infrastructure. For many years we've been teaching at Princeton about the relationship between cities and ecology, and in a way, over the years, the idea of the urban farm became something as the kind of holy grail of a sustainable city, the idea that cities could actually start to produce more of their food. And so we thought, like, what would be the infrastructure for this? So we had the idea to create a kind of super studio megastructure of farm that was floating above everybody's heads and making this shade, but we really realized quite quickly that a big floating farm would be very heavy and also invisible. So we kind of broke the farm in 2, and it becomes this kind of V shape sitting on the ground. The other thing that we did was we wanted to build the farm out of biodegradable structural materials, which there are very few of, and because we had to support tens of thousands of kilos of soil and plants. And so basically the only, there's very few things. We came up with the idea of these cardboard tubes, which Shigeru Ban has used quite often, that you use to pour concrete. And so working again with Leslie Robertson Associates created a kind of space frame out of these cardboard tubes, where these are like 2x4s, pieces of wood, which are not actually performing structurally, that's just giving the bolts something to grab onto so that we could bolt that together without ripping through the paper. But the paper is really doing most of the work in compression. And then to, as you can imagine, for horizontal forces, it's very weak, so we cut these plywood discs that become the shelves for the plants to sit on, and that gives it the lateral stability. So the whole thing kind of works together in a space frame. We also had to build these off-site because they can't get wet until they're waterproof. So we basically rented a warehouse and built these, what we call the Daisy unit, which is 7 tubes joined together. And that was our prefabricated unit that we then shipped out to the museum as they were finished. And what was great is we utilized then that Daisy unit, which is a structural unit, for the planting as well, so that, and then each tube in the middle is empty, so the farmers would basically go up and then be surrounded with one crop as they ascended to the farm. So the Daisy unit, structural unit, becomes the vegetable unit as well, and we grew about 51 different types of fruits and vegetables throughout the summer. And so that's the farm part, and then for us it's very important in terms of looking at urban farming that it's not an indoor farm, but basically the land is lifted. And then the underside becomes this kind of urban party infrastructure. So each column performs a certain party task, like seating. We had a periscope for the kids to see. There was a cocktail mixing, juicing machine. We also wanted to really bring the farm, so there was random animal sounds that came out. There was like a little place with, if you wanted to get away from the party, you could stick your head in and hear crickets. And then to make it more difficult for ourselves, we also decided it would be off-grid. So we basically did a solar installation where all the power for the pumps and the cocktail machine and all the video and sound installations was provided by solar. And And then all the water was collected off the roofs and utilized for the irrigation. And so this is what it looked like. So it's this kind of functioning piece of urban infrastructure. There you see the solar panels, and this is what it looked like underneath. And it, here you see the plants and the irrigation kind of all wound together. And this is, you know, it got quite high. It was about 12 meters at the end. We kept telling our structural engineers, like, don't worry about it. Shigeru Urban does this all the time. Cardboard, like everybody builds with cardboard. What are you talking about? Well, there were two things. One is like the only rule with building with cardboard is don't get it wet. And we had to put 800 gallons of water in this every day to keep the plants wet. And then, yeah, if that doesn't work, then don't build it outside. So they came back to us with all of these pictures of Shigeru Urban buildings that were inside other buildings. And then the damning stuff was they found pictures of like steel columns where Shigeru Urban would put his cardboard column over the steel column. So that's when they started to panic. But they managed to do it. It is the world's largest paper structure, and it has only one structural engineering award, actually. So here you see the farm and the city kind of coming together. Oh, and then we had this thing that we were calling the tool shed, that we told MoMA, oh, we're building this tool shed over here, don't worry about it. But it was secretly the chicken shed, and so on the day of the opening we brought 40 little chicks that were cute enough that they, how can you say not to a little chick? And then they grew up to chickens, and they basically had the run of the museum through the whole summer, and this is what it looked like with 7,000 people. And then a further idea, this is our proposal for the Shenzhen Biennale last year or 2 years ago, where we basically took this idea of farming and looked at aquaculture. So this is a kind of aquaculture loop. Aquaculture is really interesting. It's a completely sustainable, if it's done right, you can have like vegetarian fish and a series of plants. The plant roots take all the bad stuff out of the water in order to grow, and then those fish can eat those plants. So it's a kind of nice loop that I think all you have to do is introduce air into the water to keep it moving. And so we wanted to take that idea of the loop and actually create this kind of looping architecture where we looped people into it as well. So you could fish for the fish and then cook the fish and eat the fish as well. And then it was also this kind of massage zone because they like to do massage. The idea was that it would be like a big waterbed filled with fish where you could also get massage and eat and kind of bring the human pleasures in with the animal world all together. They cut the budget by 90%, so we cut the size from 90%. So we had a goldfish demonstration. What it was going to look like. Okay, this is an interlude. Just to show that we're not always thinking about nature and this stuff, and actually most of what we do is like interior design. So just quickly, this is a project we just finished, just showing it fast, but I put it on timer so it goes very fast. This is a loft for a fashion designer and her husband, and basically it's 600 square meters. It's an inverse triplex. They bought the ground floor, half the basement, and 1/3 of the sub-basement, so it actually goes down. They were very intimidated by the size of the thing, so we decided to chop it up instead of opening it up into these different sections. They have a lot of parties. They're from Texas. They're very engaged in the social life. So the idea was to create all these different zones which together make up the apartment and go from public to private. So that was the kind of main living room. This we call the sake box, which is storage. There are these 2 bamboo tables which come out of the ground where you can sit like Japanese style and have dinner. We thought that they would do that like once a year, but they ended up doing it almost every night. And then here's the kitchen dining area, and then beyond you see this kind of media zone where this is the kind of transition between the more public parts and the more private parts. This is all felt with a little loft for the cousins to come by. And then here you see in the back, we basically ripped out all the floors here and redistributed them because the heights were not big enough. And this is a big vertical space that runs throughout the building. They have a dog named Stitch, and Stitch does not like to climb stairs, so we gave Stitch his Stitchvator, which is an elevator shaped like a doghouse, which he operates and goes up and down. Here you see it down at the bottom. So this void really separates the private spaces. Light was an issue. The apartment is almost 35 meters long, and they have this skylight at the back. So we basically created these tubes. It's called the homework tube, and we have the shower and another tube here. And basically in between the tubes, that allows the skylight to bring the light down into the basement. Because here, you're already 3 meters, 3 meters below the street. But basically through these kind of cuts in the skylight, it brings light down so that even though you're 3 meters below, you kind of feel a connection with the outdoors. This is a courtyard here, so we just simply left the glass out there. So this is the old interior wall, creating this kind of courtyard inside the apartment. And then this is like his and her closets, and then we built her this little tunnel. She's a fashion designer, I mentioned that. So this is like her secret tunnel, and basically goes from his and her back to her like Sex and the City extravaganza closet here. And now she has actually kicked her husband out of the other closet. And this is, at one point we were pissed off at the developer and we built this tequila room. And so basically we have all these stripes, and we thought we should have one thing that connects them all. So basically there's a table that comes from the ceiling, and these come out of the ground, and this one expands. So they can all join together. You can have dinner for 70 people, which is true. And it happens, so here's like a party situation where all the tables come down, and that's dinner for 70 people. And then since she's a fashion designer, of course, you can also use it as a catwalk. So we do a lot of that kind of stuff too. So back to the cities. We wrote a book called 49 Cities. This was like a 2-year research. It started at Princeton, but we finished it in the office. The idea was to kind of look at the history of visionary urbanism. We looked at more than 200 cities, and basically the kind of, since Jane Jenkins and William White, obviously we have been, at least in America, we've been kind of suffering from the social, where every plan is kind of judged simply in terms of how bad it was for the people who live there. And then, so for example, every shade of green means something. So productive landscape is different from manicured landscape, is different from garden, is different from lawn, etc. And water is always blue. So the idea was you could kind of very quickly visualize and understand the connections between these cities. And then each one was kind of subjected to a number of tests or inquiries. So we looked at basically the fear factor, or what were the conditions that the architect or urbanist was reacting against, and was kind of very interesting. Like, nothing really linked different periods in time, but there were certain themes which came up again and again and again, which seemed already still very contemporary in some ways. So slums and overcrowding, foreign invasion, maybe not, urban chaos, polluted air. These were things that architects and urbanists have been talking about for hundreds of years in the design of cities. Then each one was categorized in terms of its form, the degree to which it was realized, its expandability, etc. And so each project is presented like this, with a drawing on one side, a little history, some source material, and then this kind of nutrition list of floor area ratio. We are the only people, I think, to have looked into the FAR of Remco's Exodus project, for example. And we also know the density of Super Studio's continuous monument. So the idea was to look at these factors: density, 2-dimensional density, 3-dimensional density, floor area ratio, population, amount of green space, etc., so that the cities could also be compared to each other, so they're all kind of ranked across the 49. And obviously we start from the earliest cities, the Roman city, looking at Paris, and for us, not Paris that we know, not the historic Paris, but really the moment Haussmann's intervention to Paris. And it's a kind of side inquiry into the nature of infrastructure and the nature of green space. And what was fascinating for us, I think we all know about connecting monuments, about this kind of 19th century slum clearance, the military aspects of Haussmann's interventions into Paris. But for us, the most fascinating aspect is that these were also the moments where the metro and the sewers were introduced into Paris along these boulevards. And so in a way, this kind of urban intervention was how Paris, for example, was able to modernize itself and transform from a medieval city into a modern city. So kind of reading through infrastructure cities in a different way. We looked at all types of projects. This is Hildersheimer, who was a contemporary of Mies and a kind of follower. He followed Mies to Chicago in the 40s. And basically, he was looking at Chicago and basically saying, if an atomic bomb is dropped on Chicago, it's going to kill a lot of people. But if we spread Chicago out over an enormous area, like this is Detroit and this is Wisconsin, it will take a lot more atomic bombs after this to kill a certain number of people. Which is very funny, except that the more we did research, it's actually recently become documented that President Truman, in instituting the Highway Act, was acting as a kind of national security measure, that it was actually a Cold War tactic to develop the federal highway system throughout America, and he argued it on those grounds, actually, so that by building the highway system, developers would be encouraged to build further away from the cities, and people would move out, so that when the Russians attacked, they would not have the tactical advantage of being able to wipe out large numbers of people. So, kind of amazing that something so ludicrous actually has screwed us so badly. And obviously looking at Team 10, where you're all familiar with, the metabolist, etc. So looking at these projects, all very diverse types of approaches, but kind of subjecting them all to the same criteria to really find out about performance. So these were the criteria that we were interested in. I think for us, the most interesting became the relationship with open space and green space. And so, for example, even in the early projects like this is Fourier's Phalanstère, which was a kind of prototypical commune of the 1800s, where he proposed that thousands of people would live together in an enormous building bigger than the Pentagon, but also in combination with a huge kind of terroir around that that would support the people. So there was a kind of agricultural production, and he was arguing for the efficiency of 1,000 people farming together versus individual farmers on individual farms, and how much more sustainable and economically feasible it was. So always these early cities had this incredible relationship with the outside, which probably culminates for us with Garden City by Ebenezer Howard, which was also an economic model for a certain fixed number of people, and every garden city had a green agricultural zone around the outside, which was not only for this idea of production, but also as a means of limiting the growth of each of these cities. So once one city filled up, this kind of green zone made it necessary to simply develop another city, and then he proposed that these would all be connected by railroad, always also connecting it through to the central city. So I think actually a much more fascinating model than he is normally credited with. And then in terms of green space, obviously the big ones are Frank Lloyd Wright and Korb. Frank Lloyd Wright famously proposed that every American be given an acre for his broadacre city. And again, once you research the thinking, this was first proposed in 1934, and in 1934 the population of the United States was less than the current population of Texas. So the idea that everyone had an acre was actually quite feasible. And even today, if you do the calculation, everyone in the United States could have 5 acres still. So, and I think that he also was really interested in the relationship between agriculture and the city. I don't know if it's never. And then the winner was actually, once we tallied everything up, strangely enough, the winner was Corbusier. So he had the most amount of open space and green space, the highest density and the smallest footprint, accommodated the largest number of people. And so that was kind of amazing, that this guy who has become the kind of poster child for the new urbanists of like, kick him while he's down. I was at a conference in China where this British new urbanist, which I didn't even know existed, basically said that the riots that were in Paris 2 years ago were Corbusier's fault. So by that logic, I would imagine also the riots in Tunisia are Corbusier's fault, so that's good. Good for you. But that basically this city performed well. So we did a kind of side study into the Radiant City. And one of the first things that we noticed was that Korb never called it the Radiant City. That was the title of the book, but whenever he referred to it, it was the Vale Vert, or the Green City. And for him, it was very important that this be read in contrast to the 19th century industrial city as a kind of way to let light and air in. And then delving deeper, I think he's always, everyone talks about Korb in terms of towers in the park. You probably heard that, this idea that it's simply towers inserted within this lawn. But this, for him, is the illustration. He says this is what the open spaces of our great cities might be like. So not the manicured lawn, by any stretch of the imagination, actually some kind of weird landscape. I mean, it's the weirdest picture, like there's a vine, there's a beehive. And so the more you read, the more you realize that what he was actually talking about, as we talk about the Ville Savoie, was this idea of a city mixed with wilderness, which is actually a kind of much more nuanced and interesting position, I think. Then lastly, we looked at the residential neighborhoods. So this is the residential kind of prototype, which form these kind of snakes throughout. And I think everybody knows about Korb's fascination with sports, so you have the sports field here. But what was amazing to us is that there's an equally large, or maybe larger, zone of community gardens and farming. So here's the vegetable plots and the potager. And he basically proposed that every citizen in the Ville Vert would have 15 square meters of garden to tend, and that every 100 residents would have a resident farmer that would take care of the crops. So again, just a reading of Korb, which for us seemed completely at odds with how he has been presented over the last 40 years or so. So that's 49 cities. So we've utilized this research and this kind of thinking about cities in a lot of our projects. And this kind of side study of infrastructure has recently become obviously much more important. There's a lot of discussion about infrastructure in the United States right now. And for us, the idea of reinventing infrastructure as new forms of public space and new ways for a sustainable urbanism to kind of rise is very important. So, we're working obviously within the context of many other people. This is Stefano Burri's non-anthropomorphic city, where he proposes that plants and animals have an equal say. We also work quite closely with Eric Sanderson on very many projects. He's written a book called Manhattan, where he's basically researched what the Isle of Manhattan was like at the moment that Henry Hudson kind of discovered it 400 years ago. And taken it in a way much further than you could ever imagine. So for us, this is the ultimate parametric design. He basically made lists of all the different trees, plants, animals that he thought could have existed on the island, and then reread historic accounts of what they saw, what they hunted, what the Indians ate, and basically created a series of, for every single plant and animal, a kind of diagram like this, where he cataloged everything that was necessary in order for that animal to exist. And then once that animal exists, all the different impacts that that animal would have on the environment in terms of other predators, etc. And so did this for every single possible plant and animal and created what he called the mirror web. So this is a kind of diagram of all the different points of connection between plants and animals on the island of Manhattan, with the most dense area being the thousands of species that interact the most, and then kind of bird species and fish species at the edge where the interaction is let's say, less. And so for us, it's kind of a very inspiring way to think about nature and technology and cities, and to utilize technology not simply to create interesting shapes, but to create much more complex models of ecology and interrelationships, because I think if cities and nature need to come together to create new forms of infrastructure, it's going to be at this level of complexity and not the kind of simplistic version. We're also kind of inspired by the writer and philosopher Michael Pollan, with whom I'm working in Berkeley now. And he's written a series of books. I don't know which one is maybe best known, but he wrote this book as well, which is The Botany of Desire, which was simply taking the one idea of writing about the history of plants from the plant's perspective. So kind of this one reversal, opening up a whole world of different interpretations of why plants do what they do. It's kind of a plant side view of the world, which we also find interesting. And then working with, we're obviously very concerned with food and food systems. One of the arguments that Pollan makes is that sustainable organic agriculture can produce, when done correctly, can produce more calories per hectare than industrial farming. So it is actually a much more efficient way to produce food. And what's exciting about obviously sustainable agriculture is that every year the soil gets better versus industrial farming, where every year gets worse. In our studies, farming is now one of the major polluters in the United States, from pig shit to nitrates, etc., and obviously not a very sustainable way to eat, etc. So what we've done with our students is take some of these sustainable farms and analyze them as if they were architecture or urbanism, and look at the different systems, not maybe to the degree that Eric Sanderson did with his mirror web, but look at the interrelationships. This is a farm at the Salatin Polyface farm in Western Virginia, where Salatin is this guy who has researched and written a lot, and I won't go into it, but basically it's a kind of complex system which utilizes a forest in combination with a farm, utilizes chickens, rabbits, turkeys, pigs, cows, grass, and vegetables all intertwined to create an extremely productive landscape where the variety and the amount of produce that he produces on this relatively small farm is quite incredible. Obviously, the only problem with this type of farming is that it's more expensive. But once food subsidies and oil prices, food subsidies go down and oil prices go up, it's my feeling that, and pollution gets taken into account, this way of farming is possibly the future. So we do that. And then, just to show a couple projects, I'm not sure, I don't remember the segue, but anyway, this is a project in New York, about infrastructure, that's right, sorry. Where we were asked to kind of reimagine the skyscraper from the 21st century on this site, which was actually completely shaded from the south by these other buildings. So the idea was, but right next to this kind of huge boulevard. So the idea was to actually take pieces of the building and cantilever them out over that street so that every piece of the building receives sun, so that the pieces are kind of new forms of housing, and the roofs are new forms of urban ecosystems, all kind of working together. So this is what it looks like a Swiss Army knife, basically. All connected here where you would have structure, I guess, some structure. And also, more importantly, the idea was that once you connect all these things, we could kind of imagine an enlarged core, which kind of sponsored this new kind of sustainable infrastructure within it. So that the core itself becomes, we call this the plug out, and in contrast with archigram's plug in. So the idea is that the tower itself could work to plug the city out of the existing infrastructure. So we basically have a series of water systems that run down the left, and heat systems that run up, and that all of these systems would work together to create new forms of public space and public amenity. So, you know, the water could be collected for agriculture, for aquaculture farms. We could utilize the heat and the water for a kind of new way of dry cleaning. We would have an incinerator for all the trash that would produce heat to kind of create new Roman baths where the citizens of the future would get together to discuss the important aspects of the day. And here we could utilize the excess heat to heat up one of those roofs, so we would have like hot camping in the summer. You can do that in Oslo too. And so the idea was that infrastructure and public space and architecture all kind of comes together in a kind of new way. I'm almost done. This is our project in Shenzhen, which we just heard the day before yesterday is going ahead. So in 9 months, we're starting construction. This is a very different, obviously, idea about infrastructure. This is the busiest shopping street in Shenzhen. More than 100,000 people per day come here on the weekends. It has huge traffic problems, as you can see. And it will be the location of a new subway running down the middle of it, connecting with 3 other new subways running across it along a 1 kilometer stretch. So the idea was to take advantage of all these new subways to completely redo the street. So this was sponsored by the government. The government basically controls 15 meters on either side of the street. That's government land, and then everything else is controlled by the leaseholders. So their idea was to take that 15-meter strip and basically build 2 15-meter wide buildings, 1 kilometer long, that would be connected with bridges to each other and to the street, so that people would be up on these bridges in this kilometer-long building, and that would somehow solve all the problems of the street. Obviously, we also felt that would pretty much kill the street, but that was the proposal. So they wanted these 5 architects to think about this, what they called the 3D street. Luckily, none of the 5 architects did that. So what we said is that we would take this idea of these 2 15-meter wide strips running down 1 kilometer and basically fold them up into a series of more like urban acupuncture, we called it, to kind of create these more discrete moments of program along the length of the street, and then connect everything with this one underground building. So these become these kind of pavilions. We originally proposed that these would be, you know, rented or developed, or, you know, that somehow the shops and this is the center of the electronics industry as well, would somehow pay and be involved. But the city, when we made it to the second round, they said, you know, we like the scheme, but what we really need in Shenzhen is not more shopping, but actually more public space. So they actually asked us to make the pavilions more public. And so basically what we did is come up with a series of museums that need to be built in the future. So there's 2 museums and a kind of park, a belvedere, and some information stands and things like that. And the idea is that at each of these moments, this 15-meter wide stripe basically folds up to become the architecture. And then more importantly in the context of this, each one also has this kind of infrastructural function. So one is collecting energy to run little fans at all the bus stops. One is collecting water that's used for irrigation. The park is composed of a productive landscape, not a kind of visual landscape, etc. Obviously not enough to really make a big difference in the city of 14 million people, but as a kind of pointing the way towards a future development of sustainable infrastructure. And I think also utilizing infrastructure, working with Arab to kind of clean up the street in a way that also creates new forms of public space. Second project in Shenzhen, this is the master plan for a low-carbon, zero-energy city outside of Shenzhen, where it was proposed that cars would not be it suggested that we could eliminate the car. I don't think everyone did. And so we basically took this as an opportunity to again look at this idea of sustainable infrastructure and focus on the street. For us, that was a kind of fascinating moment to just think about what is a street once you just simply remove the car. And what, I think we quickly realized that a street is really good because without a street, buildings are really close to each other. So the street basically keeps the buildings apart, and then what we can kind of put in as infrastructure once the street is gone. So the idea was to organize the master plan around these 8 eco boulevards, which each perform a certain function. So we have one that basically connects these 2 wildlife preserves, which are north and south of the site, with a kind of animal highway. We have one that's kind of underground recycling incinerator station with waste, and then community gardens on top. 2 different types of water. One water filtration system utilizing this kind of marsh, similar to the tower project, to filter the gray and the black water from the community and use it for irrigation, and another one to deal with the excess stormwater because like everywhere in China, the drainage issues are just horrendous. And actually to utilize this in combination with these to create a cleaner system which would then hopefully start to clean some of the heavily polluted waterways which are in this kind of fairly industrial area. There was photovoltaics, this kind of park one, farmers markets, etc. So we developed all these sections of like what the future non-car street could be. We did put one highway underneath with greenhouses up above, and actually there are plants that can filter out the carbon monoxide in exhaust. So some of the greenhouses are filled with that, others are actually producing food. The incinerator heats pools, etc. The animal highway is up there. You have a few moments, those are not hunters, they look like. A few moments where you can go and kind of watch the animal, but it's really kind of wilderness only zone. This is what it looks like. So here you see the kind of animal boulevard meeting the water boulevard, the park boulevard intersecting with the community gardens, etc. All right, so ending with, this is an idea that we've been thinking about, this kind of last moment of how to kind of think about the relationship between the city and the countryside. For us, Howard, a very interesting guy, as I said, but also kind of a jerk for proposing this, for making people think that there was this third way. For him, this is his famous 3 magnets diagram. He basically said the town is really dirty and polluted and crowded and poor. The countryside is really lonely and lack of infrastructure, no public spirit, and also a bad place. And he said the people, where would they go? And he proposed this idea that there could be a third place where everything would be fantastic. And you would have the best of the town and the country in this thing he called the town country, where you have high wages and low rents, plenty to do, and no sweating. So really a very good place. So for us, this is kind of this is the new 3 magnets. So we have the urban, which is doing pretty well, let's say, kind of revitalizing itself. The rural, which is not doing very well. And then the suburban, which is actually the worst of all worlds. So you have the ugliness of the strip mall, the high fuel costs, the crystal meth, local economy, etc. So for us, the idea would be to simply eliminate this 50-year experiment in suburbanization and simply go back to the 2-pole model, where instead of creating a third place, each one takes kind of elements of the other, so that cities become more green, more locally oriented, more community focused, more friendly places that can produce some degree of their food, and that we really work on the rural to really reinvent agriculture and industrial agriculture by kind of organizing it and conceptualizing it as we would do the city, and really kind of conceptualizing a region where country and city are working together. I have this video, I'm not going to show it though. And then, I guess this will be the last project then. As kind of one step towards this rural future, we are working with the chef Alice Waters here, who started this thing called the Edible Schoolyard in Berkeley, which is basically dealing with underprivileged children and in areas of high obesity and health problems, to really institute a program where the kids work in the garden growing food, and then they actually cook the food. And the most amazing thing about the program is that it's completely meshed within the curriculum. So they study science through cooking, they study mathematics through measuring, they study biology through gardening, and they study history through the types of food that they're cooking. And so it's kind of all brought in a way to try to encourage these children to think about healthier choices in terms of what they eat and how they live. So this is the first one in New York City. Obviously in Berkeley, everything grows and it's just perfect there, ecotopia. In New York, we have a lot more problems. We have a not great climate and we have no room. So we wanted to make it a very New York project. So here you see the proposal for the garden and the kitchen classroom. And using this is Elliot Coleman, who's another kind of incredible farmer / philosopher theorist, who's developed a system in Maine, which is very, very cold, where he can grow fresh vegetables all through 4 seasons by utilizing moving greenhouses. So you see here he's actually planting in the soil and moves the greenhouse over the soil so that in the winter he can grow cold weather crops, and then in the spring, by moving the greenhouse out and plowing all the leftovers under, he can have a second and sometimes even a third crop in the same place. And so we thought we would do that, but we didn't have the space to move the greenhouse all over. So what we proposed is that the greenhouse would kind of sit over the kitchen classroom and during the summertime, and the kids could plant out here. And then in the wintertime, they would get together and pull the greenhouse out and then utilize that through the cold months and meet in here. And then once it gets warm, push it back again. So the whole thing becomes a kind of Russian doll. This is it in the summertime, and then in the wintertime, this kind of oasis of green. And it's a kind of Russian doll project with the greenhouse, the kitchen classroom, and then this kind of series of tubes, which are shorthand for ecological infrastructure. This is where the chicken coop is, and the composting, the batteries for the solar power, dishwashing, tool washing, the biomass boiler, etc. And then this is under construction, as you can see. That's it. And that's another project. Thank you.